Hello, everybody, and welcome in to my 2022-2023 NBA in-depth preseason power rankings. Man, I am so excited to be able to do this with you all. I'm Sean Davis from LakersNation.com. If you guys are new to the channel, please do subscribe right here to the NBA Front Office Show's YouTube channel. Ring that post notification bell as well so you guys can keep up to date with the entire series because this is going to be a lot of fun. So here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be taking an in-depth look at all 30 teams. And I'm going to be ranking them worst to best. Kick off with the number 30th ranked team in today's video. And looking at their roster from, their bench to the coaching staff to the starting lineup and more. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's not going to be your, generic 12-minute tier list power rankings video that gets thrown out there a lot. No, this is an in-depth analysis on every single team here. And I am just super stoked to get into this. And we're going to kick things off with the number 30th ranked team in my preseason power rankings, the Houston Rockets. And really quickly, before we get into some ground rules, this Rockets team is really at a impasse. This is a big-time season for this Rockets organization. It's a big-time season for two particular individuals, head coach Silas and Kevin Porter Jr., starting guard in the backcourt next to Jalen Green. And starting off with Kevin Porter Jr., he has to show he's in a contract year now. He'll be a restricted free agent, which I think the upcoming CBA is going to work some things out with restricted free agency. But he will be a restricted free agent after this upcoming season. And I think he has to continue to prove and show that he can be a legitimate running mate next to Jalen Green, because this team is trying to build this team around Jalen Green, and he has to continue to show that he is the running mate for the future next to Jalen Green. And they just drafted Ty Washington. They just got his rights at the end of the first round. So the Rockets are already having their fail-safe plan in place. So like, hey, you know what? He doesn't work out. We have Ty Washington, who, as we'll get into later in the breakdown, is quite arguably the safer bet in terms of the player next to Jalen Green. There'll be a small backcourt, but you're running a small backcourt now. And then head coach Silas, and I'll talk about him as well more in depth when we get to the coaching and scheme. But personally, I think the Rockets need to let go of Silas after this season. And there'll be some benchmarks I think he has to clear to really warrant coming back for that fourth season. But I just do not think Silas has done the best of jobs here in Houston. But we will talk all about Silas and all about this roster. But let's go over some of the ground rules for this series as a whole, guys. So here's what we're going to be doing. Every episode, we'll be kicking things off with the notable additions and departures, talking about that, the team's offseason recapping. We'll dive into, like, hey, are they over the tax? Are they over the salary cap as well? I mean, because it's the NBA front office, so we have to. We'll take an in-depth look at the coaching and scheme as well for every single team and where I rank them offensively, for offensive coaching, defensive coaching, and what schemes they're running. Look at their starting backcourt and starting front court. Look at the strengths and weaknesses, the final graded notes, and then we'll get you guys out of here with my Vegas over-under. Just a little fun little tidbit to wrap things up. Now, I will also say I will try to get some special guest appearances towards the end of the episode as well. People that cover these teams. I think they'll be a fun addition as well. So I will be trying to do that, guys, to get some interviews on here as well. I think that'll be a lot of fun. But let's dive in here to this Houston Rockets team and take a look at their offseason. That, to be quite frank, the Rockets offseason, the way they got better was through the draft. And they drafted, in my opinion, 2 pound-for-pound top 10 prospects in this draft class, at least in terms of my draft evaluation on them. You get Jabari Smith Jr. at the third pick in the first round, and then you get Tari Eason at pick 17 in the first round. And then, like I mentioned, you go get Ty Washington late in the first round. You get his rights, rather, at the end of the first round. We'll talk about more in depth on these guys and when we get to their position groups here. But your biggest departure is Christian Wood. You trade him. You go get some pieces from Dallas. I mean, really not pieces. The most notable additions from that Dallas trade are Marquise Chris and Trey Burke. Marquise Chris is probably the backup center, not because he should be, but because the Rockets have just abandoned the idea of getting another backup center. Marquise Chris, I mean, he's mad at this point. And then Trey Burke, he's literally just a depth backcourt guard who's undersized that can score a little bit, but he's not going to do much, especially on this team, man, that's already really flooded with guards. The thing they don't need is another guard to try to take minutes away from one of the guys they're trying to develop, whether it's a Jalen Green, a Kevin Porter Jr., at this point, Ty Washington. So don't expect to see Trey Burke on the floor a lot, but they do go out and get him. And this is an addition I'm adding as well. Like I mentioned, over the cap, over the tax. They are not over the tax. They are still under the tax. They are not a tax-paying team this season. They are over the cap, but it's not a problem though in my eyes, because the only reason why they're over the cap is because they sent John Wall home and they waived him. They told him to pack his bags, go ahead and go home. I believe they bought him out. And he is now with the Clippers. So that is the only reason why, because his salary is now just dead cap that is on their books. But it's not a problem because, again, it will be gone next season. So, and next year, they'll have all the cap space and things of that nature to work with and operate from. So it is not a problem in the world in my eyes. They also, they did not use their $10.5 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception. They now use their biennial exception as well. So, the Rockets, in terms of their cap management and how they're handling this situation, they're just fine in my book. Nothing to really worry about if you are a Houston Rockets fan. But let's now get into the nitty-gritty and let's talk about this coaching staff and scheme here. And let's take a look at head coach Stephen Silas, and he's going to rank 30th. I do think he's the worst coach in the NBA. I'm trying to make that not sound terrible. One thing you are going to notice is that head coach Stephen Silas and the starting five and the starting players, they will have a player card and a graphic. As you guys can see, the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll see what the cards mean. So Stephen Silas, replacement level head coach. He's not a good head coach. Now, granted, if he's dead last and he's replacement level, then I think that shows you that there are really good head coaches in the game of basketball right now. But, Stephen Silas, talk about his coaching tree a little bit. He's coming from Rick Carlisle, which is, I think, where he gets a lot of his offensive influence from. He comes from Steve Clifford as well, which is kind of confusing why he's not a good defensive coach in terms of Stephen Silas. And then Don Nelson from those Believe team Warriors back in the late 2000s. So he comes from a decent background of coaches. You bring in John Lucas III from the Lakers. He was on the Lakers coaching staff. You bring in Jeff Hornacek, who was an NBA head coach as well. So you have a little decent coaching staff here, but it's going to rank 30th, and this is Stephen Silas's baby. Offensively, I think he can get pretty creative. I think as an offensive head coach, he ranks 24th, but offensively, as I described here, and again, these are more my descriptions of the offenses that these coaches are running. This 5-out motion ball screening game, because that really is what it looks like. Motion being I think they do run a lot of motion principles, and I think they want to be this just motion offense. It's running a lot of screen games and stuff like that. But at its core, man, this is the team that's going to just run a ton of pick and roll. At the beginning of the season under Stephen Silas, I'm not going to lie, the offense and head coach Silas himself really looks like a rookie head coach still. Now, granted, his first year as a head coach was just not fair, honestly, dealing with, and no rookie head coach had to go through what he had to go through in his first season. The James Harden debacle and how that whole situation panned out, still being in the thick of COVID, not playing in front of any fans, and the travel and stuff being really weird, and how the NBA handled that. So as a rookie head coach, I understand that, and that's a terrible situation to be put in. So I do understand. I sympathize with head coach Silas, and I think that's why to start the season, he still kind of looks like a rookie head coach. And when you look at head coach Stephen Silas, at the start of the season, the offense would get pretty stagnant. They would run some great secondary break options. They'll run a lot of drag or double drag ball screens in transition, or you're in your break coming up the floor. And or 7 or 77 action, as I would call it as well, or it is called. And again, they would run some nice stuff out of that, and they would really optimize Jalen Green and I think Kevin Porter Jr.'s game. This was a nice way of doing that. But at the start of the season, when that initial ball screen did not work, and it really would just turn into, an isolation possession that ends up in a terrible shot. Towards the end of the season, I think Steven Silas, and this is where the ball screen game really comes in at, Steven Silas really, I think, evolved the offense a lot more. And the offense, when that initial double drag ball screen with Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr. didn't work out, they could go into handoff game with Alperen Sengun, which is lovely. Or you could go into, and what another thing they really added in more and more, it seems, when I was watching tape back, was they run a lot more pistol action, which is basically where you have and the big towards the high post as the play the guards coming up the floor. You have 3 guys spaced out to the weak side. You have the big near the high post on the same side that the guard's coming up from. You pitch it ahead, and then you go into pistol action, and you pitch it ahead, you get it right back, and now you can go into an empty side pick and roll. So what head coach Steven Silas would do in the second half of the season, I think he got really more creative offensively, and they really, really utilized Alperen Sengun a lot more. And it really, really does seem like they are high on Sengun, which is why I think they were comfortable with trading away Christian Wood. So offensively, I like, for the most part, what he's doing, but it's a great quote. I believe it's from Mike D'Antoni, ironically, that says, it's not about what you preach, it's about what you tolerate. And offensively, honestly, it doesn't matter how great I think he is or how much I do like some of the stuff he runs offensively. When offensively, what he tolerates is not ideal, where it's just constant bad shots early in the shot clock by, Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr. especially, or, some of these guys where, just be more sound offensively and, run the offense a little bit more. And you'll get these wide open looks. You'll get a better look than what you're shooting with 18 seconds left on the shot clock. So although I like, for the most part, what he does offensively, I think what he's allowing the Rockets players to do is he's giving them too much freedom, and which that sounds so weird. But when you're shooting terrible shots, and this Rockets team, they really do play like a young team where they just shoot really, really bad shots. They can get really, really reckless with the basketball. I'm not going to blame that too much on head coach Silas, but yeah, I do like him a lot. But defensively, man, oh man, and that's where they're going to rank 30th. Where he's going to rank 30th for me. Where do I begin with this Rockets team defensively? They just look like they do not prioritize transition defense whatsoever. And head coach Silas has tried to emphasize this offseason, like, hey, we're going to be a better team defensively, better team defensively, better team defensively. But I mean, you have to convince me first, because what I've seen on tape, especially from last season, is that this team just does not care about transition defense, about getting back. They were very easily one of the worst transition teams in all of basketball last season, defensively anyway. And I do blame a lot of that on head coach Steven Silas. And then defensively in general, I don't think the Rockets really prioritize the defensive side of the ball. And I really think that, they were very undisciplined at time. I think that as well defensively that they lacked cohesion, and they lacked, a fundamental, I guess, like organization. That sounds weird coming out of my mouth, but I think you guys get what I'm trying to say here, where it just doesn't look like they're fully bought in or fully understand maybe even what they're supposed to be doing, what the defensive principles all are on that side of the ball. And again, I think that does trickle down back to coaching. They play a brand of basketball defensively that I think allows the other team here to say, you know what, go ahead, take this wide open three. And I think they need to be more physical defensively, honestly. I don't think they play a brand of basketball defensively under head coach Steven Silas. And I'm not trying to just berate head coach Silas, but I don't think they play a brand of basketball defensively that, could ultimately land them a championship or something good in terms of playoff success under Steven Silas, because you do need to play winning defense to advance throughout the playoffs. So that's my advanced thoughts on head coach Steven Silas. I rambled a lot on him, but I don't want to go too long. But let's now talk about here this starting backcourt with Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green. Jalen Green has that green arrow pointing up, telling you guys that, hey, I really think that he could take that another step this upcoming season. Where Kevin Porter Jr., let's just start here, man. The second guy, I was like, yeah, you know what? They're in a really big year for them, because Kevin Porter Jr. needs to show that he can be a legitimate running mate with Jalen Green. And I think Kevin Porter Jr. is a really interesting player. I think he is a guy that has a very unique skill set. He averaged 15 points per game last season. He averaged 6 assists as well. Shot 41% from the field, almost 38% from three last season. But you look at Kevin Porter Jr., he just, first off, his shot selection, like I kind of alluded to earlier a little bit, he just shoots a bunch of really, really bad shots. And granted, he shot a career high from three. So maybe head coach Steven Silas is like, you know what? Go ahead. You're making a bunch of them this year. He shot 37.5% from three last season, which is a significant tick up from the previous season where he shot 31%. Even his rookie season, he shot only 33% from three-point range. So he's definitely an improved shooter over the years. But some of the shot selection that he has is really, it's just frustrating. And the turnovers as well can get really frustrating as well with Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green to an extent as well. But leave no mistake about it, this backcourt is really dynamic. They're really young, athletic guys. And I mean, if you never watched Jalen Green play, or you're not the type of guy that watches a lot of Rockets basketball, just pop on a Jalen Green highlight tape, and you can just see the raw athleticism on full display from Jalen Green. And Jalen Green, down the stretch, to begin the season, he really struggled, I feel. That opening month, he shot 33% from the field, 28% from three. The month of November, same thing, didn't play that well. But right around the All-Star break, and the month of March and the end of the season off, something clicked with Jalen Green where it became all of a sudden, I mean, not all of a sudden, it was always really hard to guard him, but it was really hard to guard him, Jalen. It was really hard to guard Jalen Green. He averaged almost 21 points per game in the month of March, including a 32-point masterpiece against the Lakers in an overtime win, a 30-point game against the Spurs late in March. And then you look at the month of April, the last stretch of the season. He had a stretch of 5 games towards the end of March to the beginning of April where he had at least 30 points in all 5 games. And, if you look at the last 7 games of the season, only one of those games did he not have 30 points or more, and that was against the Raptors. And, I mean, the Raptors, they're really long, really lengthy and switchy, so you could see why Jalen didn't play too well against the Raptors. But Jalen Green, again, I'm still super high. I love Jalen Green's game. I thought it really slowed down for him. I thought he really started to pick his poison a little bit more with his shot selection. I think he got better at that. I thought he became more of a natural playmaker, just a better decision maker at the end of the season as well. He started to cut down the turnovers in the last 7 or 8 games or so. Again, he only had 1 game over 2 turnovers. And again, that was against the Raptors. And then in the entire month of March, he averaged 1.7 turnovers per game, which, steadily was dropping. Look at the beginning of the season, like the month of November, he averaged 3 turnovers a game, including a game where he had 7 turnovers, a game where he had 6 turnovers. So Jalen Green, he is a work in progress. He is a rookie or a second-year player now. So I think is trending upwards with Jalen Green. You have some decent depth here, and I'm going to talk about Ty Washington specifically, a guy that, like I mentioned, if Kevin Porter Jr. does not really pan out in this season, or to the point where you're like, okay, cool, we are really fine with this backcourt of Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green, then I think you have a guy in Ty Washington, depending on how he plays this season, where you might consider letting Kevin Porter Jr. leave, because I think Ty Washington is more of an off-ball threat, or in terms of, I think you could allow Jalen Green to be the primary ball handler offensively. But when you do put the ball in Ty Washington's hands, he is a good playmaker and a safer player in terms of he's not going to have a bunch of games where he turns the ball over. The turnovers are not really a big problem and a big concern for me personally, or not as much as I think they are with Kevin Porter Jr. So he is a good shooter. So if something goes wrong with Kevin Porter Jr. to the point where you're like, yeah, I'm not sure if Kevin Porter Jr. is the guy to pair with Jalen Green in the backcourt, I think you give Ty Washington a shot. And then again, Josh Christopher, who drafted last season, athletic dude who I like a lot. Deshaun Nix, solid guy as well, 6'5", I believe, with some size. David Nwaba, just depth, honestly, at this point. I think they're going to really see out the young guys. So that's going to be the guard room. And then moving on to this front court here with Jabari Smith Jr., who I do have them starting, Eric Gordon, Alperen Sengun. First of all, let's start with Sengun, man. Sengun. I am really, really high on Alperen Sengun. I love his game a lot. And they really, really turned him at the end of the season. And I think it's a big reason why they were okay with letting Christian Wood go. They didn't want to pay Christian Wood. So they decided, you know what? We're just going to trade you. We're just going to trade Christian Wood, trade you to Dallas. We're going to build around the young guys. And Sengun heading into year 2, I think the chemistry he really built last season with those guards being Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green, I thought was spectacular. And I think the handoff game that you can see with teams like Miami, Golden State, using guys like Draymond and Bam, not saying he's those caliber players or he will ever be those caliber players, but I think offensively you can run very similar stuff. And he has a nasty pump fake out of the corner just from the three-point line in general, who has a legitimate post move skill set, good passer as well. So, and one thing you'll hear me mention a lot throughout these breakdowns is that, in my opinion, the best thing an offensive coach can ask for is a big that can legitimately be a passing threat. And that's what Sengun is. That's what this offense is now. And I think they really, really opened things up offensively when Sengun started getting more playing time. No diss to Christian Wood, but I really do think this offense, for what this team needed, really became better with Sengun being the starting big. Because now when you're going off these double drag screens and the defense does a good job of guarding it, you can very easily go into some handoff game and slip action with Sengun and Kevin Porter Jr., with Sengun and Eric Gordon or Jalen Green. So the offense really just opens up a lot more now because of Sengun and his abilities offensively. But he's also a solid rim protector as well. He is a legitimate shot blocking threat who is not the worst guarding on the perimeter, but obviously you don't want him out there too often. He is a drop coverage big. I don't think you can get too really creative defensively in terms of your ball screen coverages with Alperen Sengun, but a legitimate shot blocker or a shot blocking threat anyway. So I am really, really high on Alperen Sengun. I think year 2, even though I'm not the highest on Steven Silas, year 2 in this offense, I really do think Alperen Sengun, if he can stay healthy, is going to take another step. Eric Gordon, just a reliable veteran, bringing that locker room presence. I think they moved him in a deadline move to a contender. I think the only reason why they haven't moved him yet is because they've been really, really stubborn, like on their asking price. But I do think he gets moved at the deadline to a contender that needs another veteran guy that can shoot and that is not the worst defensively, that can hold his own. I think he gets a bad rap for being on a bad defensive Rockets team last season. There was a few possessions in the Lakers game, for example. I'm like, wow, man, Eric Gordon, he still's got it a little bit defensively. He's not a good defender or anything, but I think he's a serviceable defender. And then Jabari Smith Jr., a guy that I was really, really high on coming out. I'm just going to read some of my notes from my scouting report on Jabari Smith, who, by the way, was a top 5 prospect in my evaluations. But you look at a really nice spot-up shooter who is a really tough shot maker. This kid is just an elite shot maker, in my opinion. But he gets really, really crafty at drawing fouls on jumpers. But it's like a DeMar DeRozan and Jimmy Butler way. It's not like a Trae Young, where I'm going to, back up into you while shooting a floater, or a James Harden, I'm going to stick the leg out. It's not like that where you'll just like, face palming whenever he draws a foul. It's legitimate. It's one of those ones where it's a skill how he's able to draw fouls and create contact on jumpers. A really, really crafty player coming off screens, which again, I think with a guy like a Sagoon, this offense can really stretch open with a guy like a Jabari Smith Jr. But he's a really athletic, just freak athlete who's not much of a playmaker, though, and shot selection, which is a problem I've kind of talked about in this breakdown already. His shot selection isn't the best, to say the least, but he's a young player. He was only 19 last season. He also, doing on the shooting thing, he shot 40% from three. He shot 43% from a field. So he was almost a better three-point shooter than he was, percentage-wise anyway, than he was from the field. Not the best defender either. But, with Jabari Smith, I think offensively he'll be just fine. Year one, he'll have some learning curves, but defensively, I don't think he'll be that great. Reason why I wasn't quote unquote as high on him as some were, like top 2 prospect, is what really concerns me about Jabari Smith offensively, and what I think separates a Chet Holmgren and what separates a Jaden Ivey and a Paolo Banchero is those guys' ability to create for themselves one-on-one and not coming off the screens and your pin downs and stuff like that to really generate your open looks. Jabari, when he has to go one-on-one and create his own bucket against a set defense, that concerns me a little bit about Jabari Smith. And that's one of my criticisms of Jabari Smith. And that's something I can't say about Apollo or Jaden Ivey or Chet Holmgren. So we'll see how that goes. And then you go get another top 10 prospect, in my opinion, in Tari Smith, a guy I viewed as a lottery pick who could be a legit 1-4 pick and pop partner with Jalen Green, who can create his shot off the dribble, really smooth from the elbow. And I honestly think has the potential and the skill set necessary to be a good stretch 5. So if you want to go small, you can, I think you could roll out Tari Eason offensively and throw him at the 5. I'm not sure if you do that year one, but I think if you really wanted to, you could with Tari Eason. I think he does have that skill set. He's inconsistent defensively, but he does show some ability to be a really serviceable defender. But not really. He does have, I think more so, he just doesn't have enough reps to being a playmaker. So that, I don't think that'll translate to the next level here in the NBA. And then also, he gets in foul trouble. He gets really, really foul happy. But you have Jason Tate, who very well could be a starter. I think he is a starter for some teams around the NBA, a really good role piece to this team, and a guy that was really, really good for him. You have KJ Martin as well, just a freaking stud athlete. Kenny Martin Jr., just a stud athlete in the NBA, who's a freak of nature, who's not a bad defender, who's a really nice depth piece for this team as well. You have Garrison Matthews, a really good shooter. And then you have, in terms of your bigs, you have some okay depth. I don't really like it all too much in terms of their depth pieces from center. Again, you have Marquise Chris, a guy that I guess is an okay backup center in the NBA. Boban Marjanovic, who I feel like is just a guy that is a good locker room presence, that if you really want to get creative and try to throw a team off, he can provide you 3 to 4 minutes here or there, but you're not playing him all that often. And then Willie Cauley-Stein, who's just really being taught, who's bouncing around the league at this point. So that's my thoughts on this roster. And then let's take a look at the strengths and weaknesses for this Houston Rockets team. They have really dynamic guard play. I don't want to act like I'm not high on Kevin Porter Jr. I feel like I was maybe a little too critical, but I really do like Kevin Porter Jr. a lot. And he really is a dynamic, shifty guard that can create his own basket, that is a good enough playmaker. I think he needs to cut down on the turnovers and really take better shots. And then if he does that, then why can't he be the legitimate running mate next to Jalen Green? I just think they need the safer bet based off of what we've seen in the past from Kevin Porter Jr. The three-point shooting, I think, is a really good strength, whether it's Kevin Porter Jr., Eric Gordon, Jalen Green, Jabari Smith now. Some of these guys that they have, well, there's Garrison Matthews. I think the list does go on. I think you have some legitimate three-point shooting strengths on this team. The handoff game that was kind of alluded to, this does go into the coaching a little bit. So there's my shout out to Steven Silas, but they can get really creative offensively now. And I think the handoff game with that kind of described throughout this breakdown with Sagoon and with Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr., Eric Gordon, after you run your little single or double drag ball screens or you go with your pistol actions, they can get really, really creative offensively. And I think a lot of that is Sagoon. And now offensively, they have a second layer. It's not ball screen. And if we don't get anything, it's isolation. No. The Rockets, they have a real offense now, I feel, and they have an offensive identity. And I think the youth, this is a really, really young team. I think it is a strength. It could be a weakness. You could view it that way as well. But wrapping things up with the weaknesses, the turnovers. They just have a lot of silly turnovers. If you look back earlier in the season against the Boston Celtics, they really, got themselves, they beat themselves. So they got themselves out of the game. This was when Dennis Schroeder was still in Boston, but they really cost themselves that game because they had just too many silly turnovers and things of that nature. By the way, Daniel Tice was on this team, so this really shows you how much they like Alfred Sagoon because they traded Tice and they traded Christian Wood. Silly shot selection, like I talked about this whole breakdown. And then the lack of a defensive identity is really other really big notable one. Again, Steven Silas has talked about how they're going to be better defensively this season. I hope so. But I need to see it first. Final graded notes. They're going to rank 32nd with a 75.23 grade. Steven Silas being the head coach. Again, I think the biggest thing for Steven Silas, the biggest metric is not going to be the wins. Because as you guys can see here, the over-under is 23.5. I think the Rockets are going to go under that. But the biggest metric is the development. He has to really show something from the development side and from the defensive coaching side this season. And that's being like, hey, okay, can Jalen Green continue taking positive steps? Alfred Sagoon keep taking positive steps. Kevin Porter Jr., all these are, how's Jabari Smith look year one? That's going to be the biggest key. And then secondly, again, he's got to show some defensive coaching presence this season and really start to get these guys to lock in defensively. Because I do think Steven Silas is, first off, he was an assistant coach. I think he could be a top-tier assistant coach, But to be a head coach, I think he has to establish a real defensive identity and defensive presence because I think you can't be a one-sided coach in the NBA. This isn't football where you can be, if you're a head coach, you can be quote-unquote one-sided because you have defensive coordinators and offensive coordinators, et cetera, et cetera. This is your team. This is your baby. So you have to really be well-versed on both sides. So I think Steven Silas has to show a defensive identity this year defensively. And then Raphael Stone, I thought he aced the draft this year. I thought he had a great draft. I thought he got two top 10 players on my board. And then you go get Ty Washington, who I think is a fail-safe player in case you don't really like what you see from Kevin Porter Jr. in terms of being the running mate to Jalen Green. So I thought Raphael Stone aced the draft. But that's going to wrap things up here on my end. Thank you guys so much for tuning into the first episode of my in-depth preseason power rankings. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure you guys hit that like button as well. It really helps the algorithm and stretches out to other NBA fans and other Rockets fans. So if you guys like what you see, stick around for more. As always, stay safe and see ya.